I woke up in the middle of the night to a bank notification. Minus $300,000. I panicked. The next day, I found out my son had spent all my money, and my daughter-in-law said, "Thanks for the car and the house. Now go live in the dump." But when I called an old flame of mine, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." The notification came at 3:47 in the morning. I know because I've stared at that timestamp so many times it's burned into my memory like a scar. Account withdrawal. $300,000. My heart stopped. Actually stopped. I sat up in bed so fast my head spun, fumbling for my reading glasses with shaking hands. $300,000. Gone. I called the bank's emergency line, my voice cracking as I tried to explain to some teenager in a call center that there had to be a mistake, but there wasn't. The withdrawal was legitimate, authorized by someone with access to my account, someone I trusted completely. Graham, my son. The sun was barely peeking through my bedroom curtains when I heard his key in the front door. He'd always kept a key, ever since his father died 8 years ago. I'd insisted on it, wanted him to feel like this would always be his home too. Now that key felt like a knife in my chest. "Graham?" My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, small and frightened. He appeared in my bedroom doorway, and I knew immediately. The way he couldn't meet my eyes, the defensive set of his shoulders. Behind him stood Fallon, his wife of 3 years, perfectly composed as always. Not a hair out of place despite the early hour. "Mom?" Graham's voice was flat. No surprise, no concern about why I might be awake at this ungodly hour. He already knew. "The money," I whispered. "Graham, the money is gone." Fallon stepped forward then, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Oh, Myrtle, you didn't think we'd let you waste it all on medical bills and nursing homes, did you?" The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. I'd raised Graham alone after his father's heart attack, worked 2 jobs to put him through college, sacrificed everything so he could have the life I never did. And this woman, this stranger who'd waltzed into our lives 3 years ago, was talking about my money like it was hers. "I don't understand," I said, though somewhere deep down I was beginning to. Graham finally looked at me then, and what I saw in his eyes made me wish he hadn't. Indifference. Cold, calculated indifference. The car's in my name now, too, and we've already put the house on the market. My house. The house I'd scrimped and saved for, paid off with 30 years of mortgage payments. The house where I'd raised him, nursed him through childhood illnesses, celebrated his graduations, his wedding. "You can't." The words came out as a whisper. "This is my home." Fallon laughed. Actually laughed. "Was your home. Honestly, Myrtle, you should be thanking us. Do you have any idea how much money we're saving you on property taxes? And at your age, maintaining a house this size is just impractical." At my age, I was 62, not 92. I still worked part-time at the library, still drove myself everywhere, still lived independently. But to them, I was already a burden to be managed. "Where am I supposed to live?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Graham shrugged, actually shrugged. "There's a nice assisted living place about 20 minutes from here. You could make friends, play bingo. It might be good for you." "With what money, Graham? You took everything. We left you enough for a few months," Fallon said dismissively. "Time to figure things out. Maybe get on some government assistance programs. There are resources for people in your situation, my situation. As if I were some stranger who'd gambled away her life savings, not a mother who'd been robbed by her own son." I looked at Graham, really looked at him, searching for any trace of the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who'd cried when his goldfish died, who'd told me I was the best mom in the world. That boy was gone, if he'd ever really existed at all. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked. Graham at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Mom, don't make this harder than it has to be. Answer me." Fallon rolled her eyes. "Does it matter? What's done is done. Graham, we should go. The realtor wants to show the house this afternoon, and Myrtle needs time to pack." Pack. As if I were moving out of a hotel room, not the home I'd lived in for 26 years. They turned to leave, and something inside me broke open. "I gave you everything," I called after them. "Everything I had, everything I was. I chose you over everyone else, over every opportunity, over every chance at happiness. How can you do this to me?" Fallon paused at the bedroom door, looking back at me with something that might have been pity if it weren't so cold. "You chose to be a martyr, Myrtle. That's not our fault." And then they were gone, leaving me alone in the house that was no longer mine, with nothing but the clothes on my back and the crushing weight of a truth I'd been too blind to see. I had raised a stranger who saw me not as his mother, but as an obstacle to overcome. I sat there for hours, staring at the walls that held 30 years of memories, all of them suddenly feeling like lies. The phone rang twice, but I didn't answer. What was the point? Soon there wouldn't even be a phone to answer. The sun climbed higher, and still I sat, paralyzed by the magnitude of what had happened. My entire life reduced to nothing in a single night. No money, no home, no family who cared whether I lived or died. I thought about my sister Margaret, who'd warned me years ago that I was spoiling Graham, making him too dependent. I'd stopped speaking to her because of it. I thought about the friends I'd lost touch with because Graham always needed something, always had a crisis that required my attention. I'd chosen him over everyone, over everything, and now I had nothing. The afternoon shadows were growing long when I finally moved, my legs stiff from sitting in the same position for so long. I walked through the house like a ghost, touching familiar objects that were no longer mine, looking at photos that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. In the kitchen, I found the note they'd left on the counter. Fallon's precise handwriting outlined the timeline. House showing tomorrow, closing in 2 weeks. Assisted living facility brochure attached. Everything neat and organized, as if they were helping me plan a vacation instead of destroying my life. That's when I saw it, tucked behind the sugar canister where I kept important phone numbers written on scraps of paper. A business card, yellowed with age, the corners soft from handling. Victor Hartley, property development. I'd kept it all these years, though I couldn't say why. Victor. I hadn't thought about him in months, maybe years. But suddenly his name filled my mind like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. We'd been close once, very close, before Graham was born. Before I'd made the choice that defined the rest of my life. My hand shook as I dialed the number, not even sure it would still work after all these years. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I was about to hang up when I heard his voice, older but unmistakably him. Victor Hartley. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could I possibly say? How could I explain what had happened, what I'd become? "Hello?" he said again. "Is someone there?" "Victor," I whispered. "It's Myrtle." The silence that followed lasted forever. Myrtle. Victor's voice was softer now, careful. "My God, Myrtle. Are you all right?" That simple question, asked with genuine concern, broke something inside me that had been holding back a flood. I started crying then, not the dignified tears of a woman in control, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone who'd lost everything. "No," I managed between gasps. "No, I'm not all right. Victor, I'm so sorry to call you after all these years. I don't have anyone else." "Where are you?" "I'm at home. I was at home. It's not mine anymore. Nothing's mine anymore." The words tumbled out in a rush, making no sense, but I couldn't stop them. "They took everything, Victor. Everything." "Who took everything?" "Myrtle, talk to me." So I did. I told him about waking up to the bank notification, about Graham and Fallon standing in my bedroom like executioners, about the house being sold out from under me. I told him about the assisted living brochure and the casual cruelty in Fallon's voice when she called me a martyr. Victor listened without interrupting, and when I finally ran out of words, he was quiet for a long moment. "I'll be there in an hour," he said finally. "Victor, no, you don't have to. I'll be there in an hour, Myrtle. Don't go anywhere." The line went dead, and I stared at the phone in my hand. not sure whether I should feel relief or embarrassment. I hadn't seen Victor in person in over 15 years, not since Graham's college graduation, where we'd exchanged polite small talk across a crowded restaurant. Before that, our paths had crossed occasionally over the years, at the grocery store, at community events, always with that awkward dance of people who'd once meant everything to each other and now were strangers. I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror and winced. My hair was a mess, my face puffy from crying, still in the same nightgown I'd thrown on when the bank notification woke me. I looked exactly like what I was. A woman who'd been discarded. 40 minutes later, I heard a car in the driveway. I peeked through the living room curtains and saw a silver Mercedes pulling up to the curb. Victor stepped out, and my breath caught. He was still tall, still moved with that confident stride I remembered, but his hair had gone completely silver, and he was wearing clothes that spoke of success, expensive suit, polished shoes, everything about him radiating the kind of prosperity I'd never known. When I opened the door, he took one look at me and his expression shifted to something that might have been anger, though I couldn't tell if it was directed at me or my situation. "Jesus, Myrtle, what have they done to you?" I stepped aside to let him in, suddenly aware of how shabby the house must look to him now. The furniture was old, the carpet worn thin in places, everything showing the signs of someone who'd spent years making do with less. Victor walked into the living room and turned to face me. Up close, I could see the lines around his eyes, the weight he carried in his shoulders, but he was still handsome, still the man who'd once told me I was beautiful and meant it. "Sit down," he said gently. "Tell me everything again, slowly this time." So I did, starting from the beginning. I told him about Graham's childhood, how he'd struggled in school, how he'd needed extra help with everything. I told him about the sacrifices I'd made, the jobs I'd worked, the way I'd convinced myself that all of it was normal, that all mothers gave everything for their children. "You remember how he was when he was little," I said, trying to make Victor understand. "He was sensitive, needed more attention than other kids. After his father died, he was so lost. I thought if I just gave him enough love, enough support." Victor's jaw tightened. "Myrtle, Graham was never sensitive. He was calculating. That's not true. Do you remember when he was 12? When we were still—" Victor paused, choosing his words carefully. "When we were still seeing each other. He told you I said something cruel to him at the park." I did remember. Graham had come home in tears, claiming Victor had called him stupid and told him his mother would never really love him. It had been the beginning of the end for Victor and me, that incident. I'd believed my son without question. "I never said those things, Myrtle. I was never alone with him that day. He made it up." The words hit me like a slap. Why would he do that? Because he knew I was a threat. He knew that if you chose me, he'd have to share you. Victor sat down across from me, his voice gentle but firm. "Even then, he was manipulating you, making sure you'd always choose him over anyone else." I wanted to deny it, to defend the child I'd raised, but the evidence was staring me in the face. Graham had systematically isolated me from everyone who might have offered support or advice. Every time I'd gotten close to someone, there'd been some crisis, some emergency that required all my attention. Every potential relationship had been sabotaged by his needs, his problems, his demands. "I was such a fool," I whispered. "You were a mother, a good mother to a son who didn't deserve it." Victor leaned forward, his eyes intense. "But that doesn't mean you have to keep paying for his mistakes. What choice do I have? They took everything. They took your money and your house. They didn't take you." He paused, studying my face. "Myrtle, I need to tell you something. Graham called me 6 months ago." My blood turned to ice. "What?" "He wanted to know about my business, my financial situation. Asked if I ever thought about you, if I'd be willing to help you out if you ever needed it. I thought it was strange at the time, but now you know he was planning this." Victor nodded grimly. "He was testing the waters, seeing if you had other resources he didn't know about. When I told him I'd always care about you, he got very interested in exactly how much I might be willing to do. The manipulation was so complete, so thorough, that I felt dizzy trying to wrap my mind around it. My son had been planning to rob me for months, maybe longer, And he'd used my past relationship with Victor as part of his research. "There's something else," Victor said quietly. "The assisted living place they mentioned? I know the owner. It's not what they made it sound like. It's basically a warehouse for people whose families want them out of the way. Minimal care, shared rooms, terrible food. They were planning to dump you there and forget you existed." I closed my eyes, trying to process it all. My son, the child I'd sacrificed everything for, had been planning to discard me like garbage. "I can't stay here," I said finally. "The realtor's showing the house tomorrow." "No, you can't stay here." Victor stood up, straightening his suit jacket. "But you're not going to that place, and you're not going to be homeless. Pack whatever you need for a few days. You're coming home with me." "Victor, I can't. I won't be a burden to anyone else." He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years. Not pity, not charity, but something warmer. "Myrtle, do you know what my biggest regret is? It's not the business deals that went wrong or the opportunities I missed. It's letting a 12-year-old boy convince me to walk away from the woman I loved." He reached for my hand, his fingers warm against my cold skin. "I'm not walking away again. Not from you, not from this." The word loved hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of all the years we'd lost. I wanted to ask if he meant it in the past tense, or if some part of that feeling had survived, but I was afraid of the answer either way. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you out of here before they come back." As I packed my few remaining belongings, I found myself wondering if this was how it felt to be rescued, or if I was just trading one form of dependence for another. But when Victor carried my suitcase to his car and held the door open for me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Victor's house was nothing like I'd expected. I'd imagined something flashy, ostentatious, the kind of place a successful businessman might use to impress clients. Instead, it was warm and comfortable, with worn leather furniture and books scattered on every surface. It felt lived in, loved, like a real home. He showed me to a guest room that was larger than my old bedroom, with windows overlooking a small garden where tomatoes grew in neat rows. "I know it's not much," he said, setting my suitcase on the bed, "but it's private. You can stay as long as you need to." "Victor, I can't impose on you like this. You barely know me anymore." He turned to face me, his expression serious. "Myrtle, I've known you for over 40 years. People don't change that much. Not in their hearts. The woman I fell in love with is still in there, even if life has tried to beat her down." That night, over dinner at his kitchen table, I found myself talking more than I had in years. Victor was a good listener, asking the right questions, never making me feel foolish for the choices I'd made. We talked about Graham's childhood, about the patterns I'd been too close to see. "Do you remember when he was 16? Victor asked, refilling my wine glass. "When he crashed your car." I remembered. Graham had taken my car without permission, driven it to a party, and hit a tree on the way home. He'd been drunk, though I'd covered that up, telling everyone it was just an accident, that he'd swerved to avoid an animal. "You paid for the damages yourself instead of filing an insurance claim," Victor continued. "Told everyone it was your fault for leaving the keys where he could find them. I was protecting him. He was just a kid who made a mistake." "He was 16, Myrtle. Old enough to understand consequences. But you shielded him from them." Victor's voice was gentle but firm. "You've been shielding him from consequences his entire life." I wanted to argue, but the evidence was overwhelming. Every time Graham had gotten into trouble, I'd been there to fix it. Failed classes, unpaid bills, job problems, relationship drama. I'd always swooped in to make it better. I'd told myself I was being a good mother. But what if I'd actually been creating a monster? "When did you first meet Fallon?" Victor asked. 3.5 years ago. Graham brought her to Christmas dinner. I remembered that night clearly. Fallon had been charming, complimenting my cooking, asking about family photos, seeming genuinely interested in our lives. She was so sweet then, so attentive to Graham. I thought she was good for him. Victor was quiet for a moment, turning his wine glass in his hands. "Myrtle, I need to tell you something, but I'm not sure you're ready to hear it." My stomach clenched. "What?" "I had Fallon investigated." "You what?" The words came out sharper than I intended. After Graham called me 6 months ago, I got suspicious. Something about the whole conversation felt wrong. So I hired someone to look into his situation and into hers. Victor reached across the table and pulled out a manila folder I hadn't noticed before. Her real name is Felicity Langston. Fallon is her middle name. He opened the folder and spread out several documents, photos, marriage certificates, court records. My head spun as I tried to process what I was seeing. She's been married 4 times before Graham, Victor said quietly, each time to a man with elderly parents or relatives with money. Each time, there were financial irregularities, mysterious transfers, properties sold under questionable circumstances. I stared at the photos. Fallon with different men, different names, but always the same calculating smile. She's done this before. 3 times successfully. The 4th husband figured it out before she could clean him out completely. That's when she moved here and found Graham. Victor's voice was grim. She didn't fall in love with your son, Myrtle. She researched him. Found out about you, about your savings, about the house. She chose him specifically because he had access to what she wanted. The room felt like it was tilting. Everything I'd believed about the past 3 years, about my son's marriage, about the woman I'd welcomed into my family, was a lie. How could Graham not know? Maybe he didn't at first, but look at this. Victor showed me bank records, credit reports, documents I couldn't fully understand but that painted a clear picture. They've been moving money around for over a year. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Your son wasn't just a victim in this, Myrtle. He became her partner. I felt sick. Physically, genuinely sick. My son hadn't just betrayed me. He'd actively participated in a con game designed to destroy me. There's more, Victor said gently. The house sale isn't going to a legitimate buyer. It's going to a shell company that Fallon controls. They're planning to flip it immediately for twice what they're paying themselves. And the assisted living place isn't just inadequate. It's where inconvenient family members go to die quietly. Die? My voice was barely a whisper. The mortality rate there is significantly higher than the state average. Patients tend to have complications that speed up the natural process. Nothing that would trigger an investigation, just neglect that leads to predictable outcomes. The implications hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just planning to rob me and abandon me. They were planning to make sure I'd never be a problem again. Ever. I think I'm going to be sick, I said, standing up abruptly. Victor was beside me in an instant, his hand on my arm, steadying me. Breathe, Myrtle. Just breathe. I made it to his powder room just in time, my body rejecting the wine and the dinner, and the horrible truth I'd been force-fed. When the retching stopped, I sat on the bathroom floor and cried until I had nothing left. Victor waited for me outside the door, and when I finally emerged, he handed me a glass of water and a warm washcloth without saying a word. He didn't tell me it would be okay, didn't offer empty platitudes about family bonds or maternal love. He just sat with me on his living room couch while I absorbed the magnitude of what had been done to me. How long have you known? I asked finally. About Fallon's history? 3 months? About Graham's involvement? Victor hesitated. 2 weeks. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Would you have believed me? Or would you have assumed I was jealous, trying to drive a wedge between you and your son? His question was gentle but pointed. You had to see it for yourself, Myrtle. You had to experience the betrayal before you could accept the truth about who they really are. He was right, and I hated him for it. Even now, with the evidence spread out in front of me, part of me wanted to find excuses for Graham, to believe that Fallon had manipulated him too completely for him to understand what he was doing. What happens now? I asked. Victor was quiet for a long moment. That depends on you. We could go to the police, try to get some of your money back through the legal system. But that would be messy, public, and there's no guarantee of success. Or what? His smile was small but cold. Or we could beat them at their own game. Something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. This wasn't just about helping an old friend. This was personal for him too. Victor, what aren't you telling me? He sighed, running his hands through his silver hair. Graham didn't just call me 6 months ago, Myrtle. He's been calling me on and off for years. Every time you had a health scare, every time you seemed lonely or vulnerable, always asking the same questions. Was I successful? Did I ever think about you? Would I help you if you needed it? The coldness in my chest spread outward, numbing my fingers and toes. He was planning this for years. He was keeping track of your support systems, making sure he knew about any resources you might turn to when he was ready to make his move. Victor's voice was steady, but I could see the anger beneath the calm exterior. He used our past relationship as market research, Myrtle. He's been treating your life like a business plan. I closed my eyes, trying to absorb this new level of betrayal. It wasn't enough that Graham had stolen from me. He'd been orchestrating my isolation for years, making sure I'd have nowhere to turn when he was ready to discard me. Tomorrow, Victor said quietly. They're going to discover that you're not as helpless as they thought, and that your old friend Victor has been paying attention to their activities. What are you going to do? His smile was sharp as a blade. We're going to give them exactly what they deserve. For the first time since the nightmare began, I felt something other than despair. It wasn't quite hope yet, but it was close. It was the desire for justice. I woke up in Victor's guest room to the sound of voices downstairs. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was, and then the events of the past 24 hours crashed over me like a cold wave. My son had robbed me. My daughter-in-law was a professional con artist. My entire life had been a carefully orchestrated lie. The voices grew louder, and I recognized one of them. Graham. I threw on my robe and crept to the top of the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the banister spindles, I could see into Victor's foyer where Graham stood facing him, his face flushed with what looked like panic. "Where is she?" Graham was saying. "I know she's here. Her neighbor saw you pick her up yesterday." Victor's voice was calm, measured. "Your mother is safe. That's all you need to know. She's my mother. I have a right to see her." "Do you?" Victor stepped closer, and even from where I was hiding, I could feel the menace radiating from him. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you forfeited any parental rights when you stole her life savings and threw her out of her own house." Graham's bravado cracked slightly. "You don't understand the situation. I understand it perfectly. You and your wife have been running a con on a woman who gave you everything. The question is, does Fallon know you're here, or are you starting to realize what she really is?" The color drained from Graham's face. "What are you talking about? Sit down, son. We need to have a conversation." I watched from my hiding place as Victor led Graham into the living room. Part of me wanted to run downstairs, to put myself between them, to protect my child the way I always had. But a stronger part of me needed to hear what Victor was going to say. "Your wife's real name is Felicity Langston," Victor began, his voice conversational. "She's been married 4 times before you. Each marriage followed the same pattern. Target a man with elderly relatives who have assets, gain their trust, liquidate everything, and disappear." Graham was shaking his head before Victor finished speaking. "That's not true. You're making this up because you're jealous. Am I?" Victor opened a laptop on his coffee table and turned it toward Graham. "These are public records. Marriage certificates, divorce decrees, court documents from civil suits filed by previous victims' families." I could see Graham's face from my position on the stairs. The confusion, the dawning horror as he scrolled through the documents. His hands were trembling. "She told me her husband died," Graham whispered. "She said she'd never been married before. Husband number 3 died, yes, of a convenient heart attack just after signing over power of attorney to his loving wife. The other 3 just lost everything they had and were discarded." Victor's voice was clinical, detached. "You were never her partner, Graham. You were her mark, just like your mother. The only difference is that you were useful for accessing what she really wanted." Graham looked up from the laptop, his face gray. "The money's gone, isn't it? All of it." "Most of it. She's been funneling it through a series of accounts, converting it to assets she can liquidate quickly. The car, the house sale, even the furniture you've been buying. It's all part of an exit strategy. But we're married. We're planning a future together." Victor's laugh was harsh. "Are you? When's the last time you saw her?" Graham's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I realized I already knew the answer. Fallon hadn't been with him at my house yesterday morning when they'd delivered their cruel ultimatum. She hadn't been with him just now when he'd come looking for me. She left, Graham said finally, the words barely audible. 2 days ago. She said she had to visit her sick aunt in Phoenix, but she took her jewelry, her clothes. His voice cracked. Oh God, she's gone, isn't she? The Phoenix story is cover. She's probably in Mexico by now, or the Caribbean, somewhere without extradition treaties. Victor closed the laptop. You've been abandoned, Graham. Just like you abandoned your mother. I watched my son crumble in Victor's living room, his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs that sounded like they were being torn from his chest. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for him, to remember the little boy who used to need me to check for monsters under his bed, but the woman in me, the one who'd been thrown away like garbage, felt something colder. Justice. What happens now? Graham asked through his tears. That depends. The house sale is supposed to close next week, but it's going to a company that doesn't exist anymore. I had it dissolved yesterday. Victor's smile was thin. The car is registered in your name, but the loan was co-signed by your mother using fraudulent documents. The bank will be repossessing it this afternoon. Graham looked up sharply. You can't do that. I already have. You see, unlike you, I actually know how these games work. Victor leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed. I've spent the last 3 months documenting every transaction, every forged signature, every fraudulent document. I have enough evidence to put you in prison for elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy. I never meant for it to go this far, Graham said desperately. Fallon said we'd take care of Mom, that we'd make sure she was comfortable. She said the assisted living place was nice. The assisted living place has a mortality rate 3 times the state average. Your wife wasn't planning to warehouse your mother, Graham. She was planning to kill her. Slowly, quietly, but definitively. The words hit Graham like a physical blow. He doubled over, retching onto Victor's expensive carpet. When he could speak again, his voice was a broken whisper. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know. But you suspected something, didn't you? That's why you're here instead of in Phoenix with your loving wife. That's why you look like you haven't slept in days. Victor's voice was relentless. Deep down, you knew this was wrong. You knew you were destroying the woman who'd sacrificed everything for you. You just didn't care enough to stop it. Graham was crying again, great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. I found myself unmoved by his tears. Where had they been yesterday when he was telling me I could play bingo in an assisted living facility? Where had they been when Fallon was calling me a martyr? Please, Graham begged. Tell me how to fix this. Tell me what to do. Victor stood up, looking down at my son with something that might have been pity if it weren't so cold. You can't fix this, Graham. Some things, once broken, can't be repaired, but you can face the consequences of your choices like a man. Are you going to have me arrested? That's not my decision to make. Victor looked up toward the stairs, directly at where I was hiding. That's up to your mother. Graham followed his gaze and saw me there in my robe and slippers, clutching the banister like it was the only thing keeping me upright. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the space that had opened between us, a space wider than the physical distance, deeper than the years of manipulation and lies. Mom, he said, and his voice was the same one he'd used as a child when he'd broken something precious and was hoping I'd forgive him without consequences. I walked down the stairs slowly, each step feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. When I reached the bottom, I stood in the doorway of Victor's living room, looking at my son, really looking at him, for what felt like the first time in years. He was 41 years old, but he looked older. Worn down by his own choices, hollow-eyed from the weight of what he'd done. He was still my child, the baby I'd carried and nursed and loved unconditionally for decades, but he was also the man who'd stolen my life savings and planned to throw me away. I'm sorry, he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I'm so sorry, Mom. I never meant for it to get this bad. I love you. I've always loved you. Please, you have to believe me. I looked at him for a long time before I spoke. Do you remember when you were 8 years old and you broke Mrs. Peterson's window with your baseball? Graham blinked, confused by the apparent change of subject. I remember. You came home crying, terrified that you were in trouble, and I told you that the most important thing wasn't the broken window, it was what you did next. Do you remember what I said? You said that good people own their mistakes and try to make them right. That's right. And then we walked over to Mrs. Peterson's house together, and you apologized and offered to pay for the window with your allowance money. I took a deep breath. You were 8 years old, Graham, and you understood what it meant to take responsibility for your actions. What happened to that little boy? Graham's face crumpled. I don't know. I do, I said quietly. I killed him. Every time you made a mistake and I fixed it for you, every time you faced consequences and I stepped in to protect you from them, I killed a little more of the good person you could have been. I taught you that love meant never having to be accountable for your choices. Mom, please. I failed you as a mother, Graham. I loved you so much that I forgot to teach you how to love anyone else. But that doesn't excuse what you've done to me. That doesn't make this my fault. I turned to Victor, who'd been watching our exchange with careful attention. What exactly are my options? Victor's expression was unreadable. We can pursue criminal charges for elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy. With the evidence I've gathered, conviction is almost certain. Graham would likely serve 8 to 10 years. Graham made a choking sound. Or, I asked, or we can handle this privately. Make him face consequences without destroying what's left of his life. Victor's voice was steady, professional. But that choice has to be entirely yours, Myrtle. I won't pressure you either way. I looked at my son, crying on Victor's expensive carpet, and felt something I'd never experienced before. Not love, not hate, but something colder and more final, indifference. I need time to think, I said finally. Graham looked up at me with desperate hope. Thank you. Thank you, Mom. I promise I'll make this right. I'll find a way to— No, I said firmly. You'll do nothing. You'll stay away from me while I decide what justice looks like, because that's what this is about now, Graham. Not love, not family, not forgiveness. Justice. I turned and walked back up the stairs, leaving my son sobbing in Victor's living room. For the first time in 41 years, his tears were not my responsibility, and I felt lighter than I had in decades. For 3 days, I stayed in Victor's house like a woman recuperating from surgery, which, in a way, I suppose I was. Something vital had been cut out of me. The part that had defined itself entirely through motherhood, through sacrifice, through the endless giving of myself to someone who saw me only as a resource to be depleted. Victor gave me space to think, bringing me meals I barely touched, sitting with me in comfortable silence when the weight of decision-making felt too heavy. He didn't push, didn't offer advice unless I asked for it. He simply existed alongside my pain without trying to fix it. On the 4th morning, I made my choice. I want to see him, I told Victor over coffee. But not here, somewhere neutral. Victor nodded, understanding without explanation. I know a place. The restaurant was small, quiet, the kind of place where business people had discreet conversations over lunch. Victor had reserved a private dining room in the back, away from curious eyes and potential witnesses to whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Graham was already there when we arrived, sitting at a round table that seemed too large for 3 people. He looked terrible, unshaven, hollow-eyed, wearing the same clothes he'd had on 3 days earlier. When he saw me, he started to stand, but something in my expression made him sit back down. I took the seat across from him, Victor beside me. For a long moment, nobody spoke. You look awful, I said finally. Graham's laugh was bitter. I haven't been sleeping. Every time I close my eyes, I see your face when we told you about the house. I keep thinking about what almost happened to you, what Fallon was planning. His voice broke. I keep thinking about who I became. Who you chose to become, I corrected. Don't talk about it like it happened to you, Graham. You made decisions. You chose to steal from me, to lie to me, to participate in a plan that would have killed me. I know. The words were barely a whisper. I know what I did. I know what I am. Victor placed a manila folder on the table between us. Before we go any further, there's something else you need to know, Graham. About your wife's exit strategy. Graham looked at the folder like it might contain a bomb. What now? The debts she left behind, in your name. Victor opened the folder, revealing a stack of documents. Credit cards, personal loans, a second mortgage on property you didn't know you owned. She's been using your identity for months to accumulate debt. Graham's face went white as he flipped through the papers. $200,000? How is that possible? Identity theft is easy when you have access to someone's personal information 24 hours a day. She's been building a debt portfolio in your name while liquidating assets in hers. When she disappeared, you became responsible for everything. But we're married. Isn't she legally responsible too? Victor's smile was cold. Check the last document. Graham found it at the bottom of the stack. Divorce papers, filed in Nevada 3 days before Fallon disappeared. According to the documents, she'd cited irreconcilable differences and claimed abandonment as grounds for expedited processing. She divorced me. Graham's voice was a strangled whisper. When did she even go to Nevada? Remember that weekend she said she was visiting her college roommate in Las Vegas? She was establishing residency for a quick divorce. Victor's voice was clinical, detached. You've been divorced for a week, Graham. You just didn't know it. I watched my son absorb this final betrayal. The last piece of evidence that everything he'd believed about his marriage, his life, his future had been an elaborate fiction. The woman he'd helped steal from his own mother had been planning to destroy him, too. She never loved me, he said, the words falling into the silence like stones into deep water. No, I said simply. She didn't. But I did, Graham. For 41 years I loved you more than my own life, and you threw that away for someone who saw you as nothing more than a tool to get what she wanted. Graham's shoulders shook with silent sobs. When he could speak again, his voice was raw. How do I live with this? How do I wake up every day knowing what I've done to you? I don't know, I said honestly. That's not my problem to solve anymore. He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not the manipulation, not the calculated charm he'd used to get his way his entire life. Just genuine, devastating regret. What are you going to do? About the charges, I mean. I looked at Victor, who'd been watching our exchange with careful attention. Tell him about the offer. Victor straightened, shifting into what I'd come to recognize as his business mode. Your mother and I have discussed this extensively. We're prepared to offer you a choice. Graham waited, hardly breathing. Option 1. We file criminal charges. Elder abuse, financial fraud, conspiracy, identity theft. With the evidence we have, you'd be looking at 10 to 15 years in federal prison. Your life, as you know it, would be over. Graham closed his eyes, his face gray. Option 2. You accept responsibility for your actions and face consequences that we design. Consequences that give you a chance to rebuild your life, but only if you prove you've learned something from this experience. What kind of consequences? I leaned forward, my voice steady and clear. You'll sign a confession detailing everything you did, everything Fallon did, and everything you knew about her plans. That document will be held in trust, to be released to authorities if you ever contact me again or if you commit any similar crimes. Graham nodded slowly. Okay. You'll enter a residential rehabilitation program for gambling addiction and financial responsibility. 6 months minimum. You'll surrender your passport and submit to regular check-ins with a probation officer that Victor will arrange privately. I'm not addicted to gambling, Graham protested weakly. Your financial records say otherwise, Victor interjected. The online betting, the casino trips, the lottery tickets. Fallon may have been the mastermind, but your gambling problem made you vulnerable to her manipulation. Graham's face flushed, but he didn't argue further. When you complete the program, I continued, you'll find employment and begin making restitution payments. Not to me, I don't want your money anymore. To a charity that helps elderly victims of financial abuse. You'll pay them $2,000 a month for 10 years. Graham did quick math in his head. That's $240,000. Less than what you stole from me, I said calmly, and far less than what a defense attorney would cost you. Graham stared at the table for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were red but clear. "And if I agree to all this, you won't press charges? If you complete every requirement successfully, if you prove that you understand the magnitude of what you've done and you never commit another crime, then yes, you'll have a second chance to build a life worth living. But," Victor added, his voice sharp, "if you violate any part of this agreement, if you miss a payment or fail to complete the program or so much as get a speeding ticket, the confession goes to the FBI and you'll serve the full sentence for your crimes." Graham was quiet for several minutes, processing the weight of what we were offering. It wasn't forgiveness, I'd made that clear. It was justice tempered with mercy, consequences balanced with the possibility of redemption. "Why?" he asked finally. "After everything I've done, why are you giving me this chance?" I considered the question carefully. The answer wasn't simple, wasn't rooted in maternal love or family obligation. Those bonds had been severed permanently. "Because destroying you won't heal what you broke in me," I said finally. "Because I spent 41 years enabling your worst impulses, and maybe giving you real consequences for the first time in your life will teach you something I failed to teach you. And because..." I paused, surprised by the honesty of what came next. "Because I want to see if there's anything left of the little boy who understood that good people own their mistakes and try to make them right." Graham's face crumpled again, but this time the tears seemed different, cleaner somehow, like they were washing away something toxic that had been poisoning him for years. "I'll do it," he said. "All of it. I'll sign whatever you want me to sign." Victor pulled out a contract that had clearly been prepared in advance. "Read it carefully. Once you sign this, there's no going back." Graham read every word, asking questions about terms he didn't understand, making sure he comprehended the full scope of what he was agreeing to. It took almost an hour, but finally he picked up the pen. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, looking at me one last time before signing. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I'm sorry." I looked at my son, former son, I supposed, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not love, not forgiveness, but a kind of sad hope. Hope that maybe he could become someone worth being. Hope that the consequences we were imposing might succeed where my unconditional love had failed. "I know you are," I said quietly. "But sorry isn't enough anymore, Graham. Now you have to prove it." He signed the papers with a steady hand. Victor witnessed the signature and locked the documents in his briefcase. Just like that, it was done. "The rehab facility is expecting you tomorrow morning," Victor said. "Transportation will be provided. You're not to contact your mother or anyone else during the program except for the designated check-ins with your caseworker." Graham stood up slowly, like an old man carrying the weight of the world. At the door of the private dining room, he turned back one last time. "Will I ever see you again?" I considered the question, feeling the strange freedom of knowing I could answer honestly without worrying about his feelings. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe, if you prove you've learned how to be someone worth seeing." And then he was gone, walking out of my life just as completely as he'd tried to throw me out of his. The difference was that this time, it was my choice. I sat in the sudden silence, feeling something I'd never experienced before. Not happiness, exactly, but a deep sense of rightness. For the first time in 4 decades, consequences had been imposed without my interference. Justice had been served without my protection. I was no longer a mother who enabled her child's worst behavior. I was finally just Myrtle, free to discover who that person might be. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new apartment, making coffee for 2. The morning light streamed through windows that overlooked a small courtyard where children played while their parents chatted on benches. It was the kind of scene I'd watched from a distance for years, always rushing past on my way to solve someone else's crisis, never pausing to appreciate the simple beauty of ordinary life. The apartment wasn't large, but it was mine. Victor had helped me find it, had insisted on paying the security deposit when I'd protested that I could handle my own finances. We'd had our first real argument about that, actually. I'd accused him of trying to rescue me the way I'd always rescued Graham. He'd accused me of being too proud to accept help from someone who cared about me. We'd both been right. "The coffee smells amazing," Victor said, appearing in the doorway with his hair still mussed from sleep. We'd been taking things slowly, rediscovering each other after 40 years of separate lives. Some nights he stayed over, some nights he didn't. It was a rhythm we were still learning, but it felt right in a way that nothing had felt right in years. "Mrs. Chen taught me how to make it properly," I said, handing him a mug. Mrs. Chen was my 87-year-old neighbor who'd adopted me the day I moved in, insisting that I join her for afternoon tea and gossip about the other residents. She reminded me of what I might have been if I'd never had children, if I'd been allowed to develop relationships that weren't based on constant giving and never receiving. Victor settled into one of the kitchen chairs I'd bought at a secondhand store. Everything in the apartment was either used or inexpensive, not because I couldn't afford better, but because I was learning to live within my means, to understand the difference between what I needed and what I thought I deserved. It was a lesson I should have learned decades ago. "Any word from the caseworker?" he asked. I nodded, settling across from him with my own coffee. "Graham completed the program. He's been placed in a halfway house and found a job at a warehouse. His first restitution payment was made on time." Victor's expression was carefully neutral. "How do you feel about that?" It was a question he asked regularly, and one I'd learned to answer honestly instead of deflecting with what I thought he wanted to hear. "I don't feel anything," I said, and it was true. He's fulfilling the terms of our agreement, which is what I expected him to do. Beyond that, his life isn't my concern anymore. The first few months had been harder. I'd catch myself wondering if Graham was eating enough, if he was making friends in the program, if he was scared or lonely or regretting his choices. But each time those thoughts arose, I'd remind myself that worrying about his comfort wasn't my job anymore. His well-being was his responsibility now, just as it should have been for the past 23 years. "I got a letter yesterday," I said, pulling an envelope from the stack of mail on the counter. "From my sister Margaret." Victor raised an eyebrow. Margaret and I hadn't spoken in over 15 years. Not since she'd told me I was spoiling Graham and I'd chosen my son's feelings over her honesty. She heard about what happened through our cousin Linda. Wants to know if I'd like to come visit her in Colorado for Christmas. "Do you want to?" I considered the question. The old Myrtle would have automatically said no, would have found reasons why she couldn't possibly leave town, couldn't possibly put herself first. But the woman I was becoming had different priorities. "I think I might," I said. "She mentioned that her daughter Sarah just had a baby. I've never met my great niece." Victor smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him 4 decades ago. "I think that sounds wonderful." We drank our coffee in comfortable silence, reading different sections of the newspaper, occasionally sharing interesting articles or commenting on the weather. It was the kind of mundane domestic routine I'd never experienced, having spent my adult life managing crises and emergencies instead of enjoying peaceful mornings. My phone rang, and I glanced at the caller ID before answering. "Hello, Detective Morrison." Victor looked up sharply. Detective Morrison was the officer who'd been handling the investigation into Fallon's other victims, the families she'd conned before targeting Graham and me. "Mrs. Hartwell, I wanted to update you on the Langston case. We've arrested her in Costa Rica. She'll be extradited to face charges here within the month." I felt a mild satisfaction at the news, but not the vindictive pleasure I might have expected. Fallon's capture wouldn't undo the damage she'd caused, wouldn't restore the trust she'd shattered, or heal the relationships she'd destroyed. It was simply justice, finally catching up with someone who'd spent years evading consequences. "Will I need to testify?" I asked. "Possibly, though we have enough evidence from the other cases that your testimony might not be necessary. I'll keep you informed." After I hung up, Victor reached across the table and took my hand. "You okay?" "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." I turned my hand over, interlacing our fingers. A year ago, news like that would have sent me into a panic. I'd have worried about Graham, about whether this would affect his recovery, about whether I should visit him or call him or somehow try to protect him from the stress of it all. And now? Now I know that Graham is an adult who made his own choices and needs to live with the consequences. Fallon's arrest is a consequence of her choices, not something I need to manage or fix. I squeezed Victor's hand. I'm learning to let other people handle their own problems. It was a revelation that had come slowly, through months of therapy and careful self-examination. Dr. Reyes, the counselor Victor had recommended, had helped me understand that my compulsive need to rescue Graham hadn't been love. It had been control. By constantly solving his problems, I'd maintained my importance in his life while preventing him from developing the skills he needed to function independently. I'm proud of you, Victor said quietly. I know how hard this has been. It's getting easier. I stood up, carrying our empty mugs to the sink. I used to think that love meant sacrifice, that being a good mother meant putting my child's needs before my own in every situation. But I'm starting to understand that real love sometimes means letting people face their own consequences, even when it hurts to watch. The doorbell rang, and I went to answer it. Mrs. Chen stood in the hallway holding a covered dish and wearing her best judgment face. You have a man sleeping over again, she announced without preamble. Good morning to you too, Mrs. Chen. Is he going to make an honest woman of you? Or are you just going to live in sin until you're both too old to enjoy it? I laughed, actually laughed at her bluntness. The old Myrtle would have been mortified by such a direct question, would have stumbled over explanations and apologies. But I'd learned that Mrs. Chen's sharp tongue came with genuine affection, and that her concern was rooted in friendship rather than judgment. We're taking things slowly, I said. Figuring out who we are now, not who we were 40 years ago. Humph. Mrs. Chen pushed past me into the apartment, heading straight for the kitchen where Victor was reading the sports section. You, she said, pointing at him with a wooden spoon. What are your intentions with my neighbor? Victor looked up, completely unfazed by her interrogation. To make her happy, if she'll let me. Good answer. Mrs. Chen set her dish on the counter. Beef stew. Real food, not that processed garbage young people eat. You'll both waste away to nothing if you keep living on coffee and toast. She bustled around my kitchen like she owned it, pulling out bowls and arranging silverware. I'd learned not to argue with her when she was in nurturing mode. Besides, her cooking was extraordinary, and I was still learning to accept kindness without feeling obligated to return it immediately. Mrs. Chen, I said, would you like to have dinner with us tonight? Victor's making his famous lasagna. Famous, is it? She gave Victor a skeptical look. I suppose I could supervise, make sure he doesn't poison you. Victor grinned. I'd be honored by your supervision. As Mrs. Chen continued to rearrange my kitchen to her satisfaction, I felt something I'd rarely experienced in my adult life. Contentment. Not the frantic happiness that came from solving someone else's problems, not the desperate joy of being needed, but a quiet satisfaction with the life I was building for myself. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at it automatically. The number was unfamiliar, but the message made my blood run cold. Mom, it's Graham. I got a new phone. Can we talk? I stared at the screen, feeling the familiar tug of obligation and guilt. The old Myrtle would have called immediately, would have dropped everything to address whatever crisis or need had prompted him to reach out. But the woman I was becoming understood that his desire to talk didn't create an obligation for me to listen. I showed the message to Victor, who read it without comment. What do you want to do? He asked. Nothing, I said, and meant it. The agreement was that he would have no contact with me during his rehabilitation. He's violated that agreement by sending this message. If he continues to contact me, the confession goes to the FBI. Are you going to respond? I considered it for a moment, then deleted the message without replying. No. My silence is an answer too. Mrs. Chen, who'd been pretending not to listen while arranging my spice rack, nodded approvingly. Good. Some people need to learn that not everything is about them. The rest of the day passed peacefully. Victor and I went grocery shopping for dinner ingredients, stopped by the library where I'd started volunteering twice a week, and took a long walk through the park where couples and families enjoyed the crisp autumn weather. It was an ordinary day, unremarkable in every way except for how perfectly it fit the life I was choosing to build. That evening, as promised, Victor made lasagna while Mrs. Chen supervised and offered unsolicited advice about everything from proper cheese grating technique to the ideal oven temperature. I sat at my small dining table, watching them banter and tease each other, and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine we were sharing. This was what happiness looked like, I realized. Not the desperate highs and crushing lows of my relationship with Graham, but the steady pleasure of being surrounded by people who saw me as I was and chose to be in my life anyway. After dinner, Mrs. Chen declared the lasagna adequate and returned to her own apartment. Victor and I settled on my small couch, his arm around my shoulders as we watched an old movie on television. "Any regrets?" he asked during a commercial break. I thought about the question seriously. Did I regret the 40 years I'd lost to enabling behavior and misplaced priorities? Did I regret the life I might have had if I'd made different choices earlier? No, I said finally. I can't regret the path that brought me here. If I'd been a different person, made different choices, I might never have learned what I needed to learn. I might never have understood the difference between love and control, between helping and enabling. And if Graham completes his program, if he changes, becomes someone worth knowing again, then maybe someday we'll have a conversation about whether there's a place for him in my life. But it will be my choice, made on my terms, based on who he proves himself to be. I settled more comfortably against Victor's shoulder. And if he doesn't change, if he remains the selfish, manipulative person he was, then I'll know I made the right decision in walking away. Victor pressed a kiss to the top of my head. "Either way, you'll be fine." "Yes," I said, and felt the truth of it settle into my bones. I will be. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, dusting the courtyard where children had played that morning. It was beautiful and peaceful, covering the world in a clean white blanket that made everything look fresh and new, just like my life. Just like the woman I was finally learning to be. I was 62 years old, and for the first time in decades, I was exactly where I belonged. Now I'm curious about you, who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.